Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to your Daily Penguin. This is my slow pub crawl through my Penguin classics, one by one, book by book, author by author, instead of doing a normal bookshelf tour. This is what Hannah at Hannah's Books refers to as my March of the Penguins. And we are in the ancient world. We are dealing with the authors of ancient Greece and Rome because long before I thought of doing a Daily Penguin, I sort of quasi-organized the books that way, not in any rigor, not with any kind of exhaustion, but still enough so that we're not bouncing around. And I put the question to you, of course. I put the question to you whether or not you would want me to bounce around. And the almost universal response was, no, let's just go through the whole thing, shelf by shelf, period by period. So we are in the ancient world, and recently we've been talking about anthologies. Penguin puts out, because Penguin Classics, in addition to being for the general reader, are also very popular or have been in schools, they put out a lot of anthologies of work from the ancient world. One of the things that gets anthologized the most is verse. But today, we're not dealing with an anthology. Today, we're dealing with one poet. One ancient Roman poet. This is the poet Ovid. And this is a little Penguin classic of the satires of Horace and Persius, who was a much younger a poet of basically the next generation after Horace, with, say it with me now, a Roman fresco on the cover. Horace was born in 65 BC to a father who had been himself a slave and had worked for his freedom or been awarded it. We're not really sure. And Horace's father was a remarkable man. Horace was born out in the provinces in southern Italy. He wasn't born in Rome or anywhere near Rome. He was very much a rustic. But his father had dreams for him. And as apparently a wealthy enough freedman with money and with land, he decided to act on those personally rather than lease them out, as well-to-do Romans and Italians at the time often did. He took the education of his remarkable son in hand and sent him to Rome to the best teachers that he could afford, and led him through Rome. The portraits that Horace gives us in his poems of his father bear no trace of the acid tongue-in-cheek or the world-weary cynicism or anything like that inhabits so much of the rest of his personal portraits all throughout his poetic work. They instead glow with affection and cannot possibly be false. And they describe a father who led his son by the hand through the city of Rome, pointing out personal natures, oddities, quirks of personality, slowly teaching him his nature, as Horace puts it, and who then later put up even more money to send Horace to a kind of philosophical finishing school in Athens. No small thing at all for the son of a slave, an ex-slave. And Horace was there when the Roman world was thrown into upheaval by the assassination of Julius Caesar. And he was there when Marcus Brutus went through Greece, savoring the culture, talking with all the learned men, disputing philosophy, reading in the libraries. And he was there when Brutus went through recruiting men for his army. And Horace tells us that he and a bunch of his fellow students enthusiastically joined in to the cause of Brutus. And Horace was a tribune. He was an officer in the armies of Brutus. And, of course, the armies of Brutus lost at Philippi. And Horace tells us, again, here we don't know for sure, these being literal, but he tells us that he threw down his shield and ran. That he just fled. That he wasn't brave. He wasn't a brave soldier. He wants us to make sure that we know that. Now, that could be a poetic structure, a poetic motif. It was in his Greek models, the Greek poets that he modeled a lot of his early verse on. They often used motifs like that, and they can't all be true. So it could be that Horace, wasn't cowardly, but realized that discretion was the better part of valor. One way or another, by the time he was in his early 20s, he was back in Italy and penniless. He had been on the losing side. The land that his father owned was not his anymore. He was dispossessed, and his father was dead. We don't know anything about his mother. But suddenly he was in Italy and then in Rome with no patrimony and no means, and he immediately started working. And we know that he wrote verse at this period. He started writing verse right away. It seems clear that literature was always his calling. But he also got a job. He also got a job as a clerk in the Treasury, which probably wasn't onerous work, and it was probably work that could be contracted out as well. It might not have been necessary for him to report to the Treasury building every day and go down to the basement and start working with the scrolls. That might not have been necessary. He might have been able, for a couple of brass pieces, to delegate someone to do that for him. One way or another, whether he worked all day or not, he wrote vigorously, and his verses circulated, and people started to know them, and people started to talk about them, and they came to the notice of the Roman poet Virgil, who recognized in them immediately a genius that comes along once in a generation, maybe twice in a generation. In Virgil's own generation, it was lucky. Some generations are. And put Horace forward to Maecenas, the sort of the friend of the Roman Emperor Augustus and his kind of cultural czar. Someone who was always on the lookout for up-and-coming writers, up-and-coming polemicists, good men in the courts, that sort of thing. And that did it. That changed Horace's life forever, as he tells us over and over again. Again, the many parts of his poems that sing the praises of Maecenas' generosity are clearly telling the truth. Those two are not touched by his tongue-in-cheek, by his humor or his sarcasm. Because Maecenas didn't just bring him to the attention of Augustus. Maecenas also gifted him what Horace refers to as heaven on earth. He gifted him a small but self-sufficient farm with a spring that never fails, and a little bit of woods, and a simple house, and a vineyard. A couple of slaves to work the land, a couple of slaves to work the house, a tiny competence that it was his alone, and that all he had to do for that was to continue doing what we clearly know from his years at the Treasury he would have done anyway, which is to write. He was asked, the later on he got in his career, the more prominent he became in his career. Once Virgil was dead, he was practically the national poet. He was well known, well quoted, well liked, and later on in his career, when that was all true, he practically became a state poet. You can't think, when you read his poetry, you can't think of anyone less suited for the job, except maybe Catullus. But still, the whole time that this was happening, I mean, the farm, the little farm that Maecenas gave Horace, truly struck a chord with him. It was a relief. It was a retreat from the hurly-burly of Rome. And many commentators over the centuries have pointed out that it set up a dichotomy in Horace that he is at no pains to hide. The dichotomy between when he was in the country for just long enough, he started to pine for the city, and when he was in the city for just long enough, he started to pine for the country. Fortunately, he had both. And throughout that whole time, he wrote painstakingly and exactingly. It doesn't seem that way when you read a lot of the verses. They are designed and crafted to seem dashed off, conversational. And they are designed and crafted to convey a personality of the poet as someone who doesn't care all that much. But I worry, when it comes to Horace, when it comes to English translations, I worry that that's all that will come through, and that you won't notice the contradiction, the massive contradiction to that poise that is the verse itself. Because you're not getting the verse itself when you get an English translation. You're not getting anything close. Far less so with Horace than with many, many other figures in the ancient world. Because the thing I cannot stress enough about his satires and his odes and his epistles and his epodes is how brilliant they are. Technically, form-wise, how brilliant they are. Horace tried everything. And he worked at everything until the thing that he could present to the Roman public, to the reading and listening public, was as close to perfect as the Latin language could become. And delving into those perfections in Latin is astonishing. Just an astonishing experience. It's the brilliance of Virgil that we've talked about already, Only your Daily Penguin. This endless nightmare of your Daily Penguin. It's the brilliance of Virgil. Only with Virgil, Virgil is brilliant in one register, over and over and over and over again. And the brilliance scintillates, but it stays in that register. Horace does not do that. He's brilliant in a dozen different registers. It's amazing. Absolutely amazing. Once upon a time, for centuries, schoolboys were introduced to that in their advanced Latin classes, and they got to know Horace, whether they, as Byron famously puts it, you get to know him whether you love him or not. Byron complained that he got to know Horace very well, but never came to love him. Byron claims that in a poem. Byron did not feel that in real life. There's far too many scholars take that little famous little mention seriously when actually Byron lived for Horace, and you can easily tell. But anyway, Horace went on, became a friend and a favorite of the Emperor Augustus, and continued to write poetry for the rest of his life. There was no unseemly exile. There was no fall from grace. There was no anything like that. Occasionally, a new work of his, the Odes being one example, would come out for the Roman public, and the reception would be less than enthusiastic, less than ecstatic, specifically because the Roman public was not able to keep up with Horace. It wasn't that these poems were worse. It was that they were drastically different. They were recondite. They were trying their own things, and as we can now look at them with the hindsight of 2 millennia, trying those things brilliantly. But to a reading public that was accustomed to the satires, the Odes would have been the dark side of the moon. It's understandable that a lot of people would have said, well, what is this? It's a source of pure joy now for us to look back and see those things. For us to see a poet who somehow, despite all the inducements to the contrary, think about those inducements for a minute. First, you're in your early 20s and you're penniless. And you're canvassing for a job with the state, but you're also writing for money. What strength of character would you need to have, or what assurance of your own inner talent would you need to have to be in situations like that and not kowtow to the taste of the day? We have no evidence that Horace ever kowtowed to the taste of the day. Those were the circumstances at the beginning, and then the circumstances where you've got a wealthy and powerful patron who gives you a home, a beautiful, peaceful little home. And your patron probably has preferences and tastes, and you don't do it. You don't do it. Maecenas was among the people who had no idea what to make of the Odes. And then you have the ear of the emperor, the most powerful man in your world, who clearly wants you to start writing national epics. Well, Horace did. He wrote the equivalent of a national anthem, a kind of national anthem. He also wrote a couple of poems in honor of Augustus's stepsons, Tiberius and Drusus. But they don't read that way. They do technically fill the need, but they do not do what you would expect. We can easily picture some poet of the exact same time who's not known or is known in fragments. Ausonius Rufus. We could easily picture someone like that writing those things just to beat the band with timpani and strings. And Horace doesn't do that. Instead, his poems are searching and slightly ambivalent. In other words, in the entire course of his life, he listened to his muse first. And it comes through in the poems, even in bad English language translations. This translation is by Neil Rudd. Penguin also did an edition. I don't think this one was ever published in the United States. This is by James Michie. This is just the Odes. And what else did they do? They also did this old edition by W.G. Shepherd, the Odes and Epodes. This has a loving introduction by Betty Radis from Penguin Classics. And as far as I know, this is the one that Penguin does now, and they've had the wisdom. Again, it's all Roman frescoes. That's all it is Roman frescoes. But I think this is the edition that Penguin still does, and I don't think they've updated it at all. As well, they shouldn't. Shepherd's efforts are certainly very conscientious, and Betty Radis's introduction just is wonderful. Just glows with affection for Horace, and all throughout these poems, you get that genius, the genius that I talked about. You can see that Horace is mainly communing with himself instead of kowtowing, instead of chasing after fads. And I think that's part of what makes him such an amazing reading experience, even for students. And a lot of those students go on in the pre-modern era, pre-World War I era. A lot of those students went on to read and consult with Horace for the rest of their lives. This is an author who comes to feel like a friend in a way that, for instance, Virgil never does, in a way that Cicero never does. He comes to feel like someone that you like as well as admire. And part of it is because he can be relied upon regularly to relapse into just writing about ordinary human things. He's constantly, in his poems, urging friends to come over, sit by the fire with a cup of wine, relax, let's talk. He is a very convivial voice in his poetry. And it's so consistent over so many forms and so many years that I find it hard to believe it wasn't true, that it wasn't the way Horace really was. That casts a spell. It certainly casts a spell on me. I cannot imagine life without Horace. And unlike many of the Roman authors that we've seen so far in the Daily Penguin, we were never really in danger of having a life without Horace. He was taught in schools. Quintilian tells us he was taught in schools. He was esteemed as you couldn't help but do. If you can read him in the original, you will be blown away. Anyone would be, by what is going on, by this lightning play of brilliance over so many different subtle variations in verse form. It's just amazing. So he was taught in schools. He was copied often. He was never proscripted. He was never lost. And we have a vast manuscript tradition thanks to the Benedictines, who have a long history of being absolutely manic squarelers away of books. Such a bookish order. Your Benedictines, over the course of 500 solid years in what are so-called Dark Ages, could be absolutely counted on to make 200 copies of whatever they encountered, and never to throw any book away. They would have been very bad at unhauling on BookTube. But as a result, we have a very good tradition with Horace and a ton of scholarship. A ton. So many people have turned to this author for translating and for annotating and for commentaries and for histories. We have a life of Horace by Suetonius, and we have all that Horace tells us about himself. He's constantly throwing in obvious and very obscure references in his poetry that can be hammered down, that can be... He was clearly speaking to a reading audience that wanted those things to be right, and that remembered them. He was a lot. I think a lot of his poetry is written for his exact contemporaries, and as a result of us having that huge tradition, there is also another Penguin volume, one in a series that I have talked about often on this channel, and that is Horace in English, which goes through all of his works. This is edited by D.S. Carn Ross and Kenneth Haynes, and it goes through that vast tradition of Horace, all the variations that people have come up with, all the different ways to try to capture. That is probably a Benedictine manuscript. Does it tell us? Yeah, it's a Benedictine manuscript from... it doesn't give us the date, but it doesn't give us the date. But that looks like the 15th century, 14th, 15th century. It's almost certainly Benedictine. They squared away everything. But this is another one of the books in that series of where that's what you get over the course of decades. You get many different hands translating little bits and pieces of Horace. So you don't get the whole thing, but you get a sense of the variation involved. And that can help a lot, especially with a poet as brilliant as Horace. And that is the Penguin Classic array, and you can guess what that's going to cause me to go on about, right? You can guess. Why is this the Penguin Classic array? Why is this true? Look at how thin these things are. I want to show you a Penguin Classic. We're not going to get to it for quite some time. It will be summer by the time we get to it. But I want to show you something. This is a Penguin Classic with the complete poems of John Donne. That's the book. This is the complete poems of John Donne. Why is there no complete Horace? Why? I don't know. I have no idea why that is true. I have no idea why it doesn't happen even today. David Ferry had a book, a translation of the Odes of Horace that sold fairly well. It got Horace talked about in the New York Times and the New York Review of Books. Why? Why was it just that? I realize it's a Herculean task to translate any Horace, even a line, but why are we dealing with this great author? I mean, there's an argument to be made, I guess, that Plutarch is an ancient historian, and so he doesn't really speak to us today. He's only of interest to historians. Some malarkey like that. There's no argument like that can be made for a poet like Horace. He speaks directly. He partakes of the poetry that is always eternal, the poetry that is always news, the news that stays fresh, that sort of thing, all of that stuff. Why is there no volume of Horace? Why is there no Penguin Classic volume that is the poetry of Horace, the complete poems of Horace? If there is one, I don't know what it is. And if there is a poet who has earned it more than this one, I can't think of one. So as usual, my Daily Penguin is going to wind up with talking about a Penguin Classic edition that I don't have to hold up to you. Penguin Classic edition doesn't exist yet. And that is the poetry of Horace, the complete poems of Horace, in one volume. I would argue that that volume should be large. It should be a Penguin Classic Deluxe edition with French flaps. It should have a new introduction. And I would argue that it not be the same poet. So get somebody to do the odes, get somebody to do the epodes, get somebody to do the satires. Get a different poet for each one, close to Horace in English, only not in fragments. Get them each to do an individual work, and maybe introduce it themselves, or new introductions for each individual work. That would not be a big book. That would be about the size of the complete poems of John Donne, and it ought to exist. That is not the first time that I have winded up Daily Penguin by calling for a Penguin Classic that does not exist, and it won't be the last time either. It probably won't be the last time this week. So now you are spiritually prepared. So I'm going to wrap this up for now. That is your Daily Penguin for today. Horace. Now, my voice is going to take on that tone every time I mention this poet. It's been true for almost 4 years of BookTube videos. Whenever he comes up, I will automatically sound like I am talking about an old friend rather than a favorite literary figure. And unfortunately, I know this is going to sound incredibly snotty, I don't know that you will feel that if you only encounter him in English. Maybe you will, but I think you'd probably have to read a lot of translations, not just one. Not just, for instance, the Mishi, or any one poet, not to slight him. This is a case where I would strongly advise you to go to your university library or your local library if they have a classic section and read as many translations of Horace as you can. If you don't have Latin, then this is an author you really need to know in many voices to try to triangulate what is calling to so many translators and what makes people like me change our tone of voice when we hear the name. I'm not going to talk about many figures in the Daily Penguin series just in toto. For the entire year of 2020, I'm not going to talk about many figures that mean as much to me as Horace. And you're going to have to take my... If you're a monoglot reader, you're going to have to take my word for that. But anyway, it won't be just my word. Read up on anyone's reaction to Horace. Read any essay about him. You'll get that same feeling. But anyway, that's it for today. That is the I want to say the complete poetry of Horace, but unfortunately I can't. But anyway, I'll wrap this up, but we'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.